On Christmas night, Jesus confided to a humble priest a sorrow so gentle and yet so piercing that it can change the way we live if we truly listen. It was not spoken to crowds, nor written in large letters for the world to see. It was entrusted quietly to the servant of God, Don Dolindo Ruotolo, a priest from Naples whose life was hidden, misunderstood, and heavy with suffering, yet luminous with trust. Jesus revealed to him what he called the greatest sorrow of his Christmas, a sorrow that does not belong only to Bethlehem 2,000 years ago, but one that is repeated every year, in every age, and even now within our own hearts. Don Dolindo lived in the 20th century carrying a cross that few could bear. He was slandered, marginalized, accused, and treated as if his fidelity were a threat. And yet, he endured all of this with an interior peace that astonished those who knew him. His strength did not come from recognition or human support, but from an intimacy with Jesus that was simple, direct, and childlike. He spoke with Jesus not as a distant master, but as a friend who entered his soul and spoke heart to heart. For Don Dolindo, Christmas was never a memory of something that happened long ago. It was a living mystery, something happening now, something unfolding within the soul. In his interior life, Jesus did not appear as a powerful judge seated on a throne, but as a small, fragile child, a child who trembles, a child who knocks softly at the door of the human heart. In one of these interior conversations on Christmas night, Don Dolindo perceived Jesus speaking to him in a way that overturned all his expectations. There was no apocalyptic warning, no grand revelation about future events. Instead, Jesus spoke of pain. He said simply, "I am cold." At first, the words seem almost strange. Bethlehem was cold, yes. The cave was poor, exposed, and harsh. The child had straw for a bed and the breath of animals for warmth. But Don Dolindo understood immediately that Jesus was not speaking about the cold of winter air. The cold Jesus spoke of was far deeper and far more painful. It was the cold that comes from human hearts, an icy chill born not of snow or wind, but of distrust, anxiety, and self-reliance. Jesus made Don Dolindo understand that the true winter he suffers is our lack of trust. This is a truth that unsettles us because it touches the core of how we live. We approach Christmas weighed down by worries. We calculate, we fear, we plan endlessly. Even in prayer, our minds are crowded with concerns. We worry about money, health, relationships, the future, and all of this seems normal, even responsible. Yet Jesus reveals something shocking. Excessive worry leaves him out in the cold. Anxiety, shows Don Dolindo, is not neutral. It is a silent refusal to trust divine providence. It is like closing the door of the heart and saying, "I will handle this myself," not necessarily with words, but with an attitude of control. And when we do this, the soul grows cold, the fire of trust goes out, and Jesus, who made himself small to be close to us, finds no warmth. Don Dolindo perceived how gentle and vulnerable Jesus makes himself. He becomes small not to frighten us, not to overwhelm us with his majesty, but to beg for our love. And yet, so often we treat him as if he were distant or irrelevant, sometimes even as a decoration, a statue taken out once a year, admired briefly, and then forgotten. Jesus comes alive in the soul, but we are distracted, busy, preoccupied, and he stands quietly waiting. In his Christmas letters to his spiritual daughters, Don Dolindo often described a recurring vision. He did not see the child Jesus lying passively in the manger. He saw him moving, reaching out, stretching his tiny hands. This detail is crucial. Jesus is not indifferent. He is searching. In these interior words, Jesus says to him, "I come down from heaven to seek a refuge, and the refuge I want is your heart." This reverses our entire way of thinking about Christmas. We are accustomed to approaching God with requests. We ask for blessings, solutions, relief, and favors, health, peace, financial stability, answers. But Don Dolindo shows us something radically different. At Christmas, it is not primarily we who ask God. It is God who asks us. He asks for a place to rest. He asks for warmth. He asks for trust. Here lies the great paradox that Don Dolindo contemplated with awe. The Almighty, the the creator of galaxies, chose to become unable to feed himself, unable to clothe himself, unable even to stand. Why would God choose such weakness? Not because he needed it, but because we did. If he had come in visible glory, blazing with power, we would have fled in fear, crushed by our sense of unworthiness. But before a crying child, afraid and vulnerable, our hearts soften. We draw near. Jesus told Don Dolindo, "I made myself nothing so that you would not fear approaching my all." These words dissolve a fear that many carry silently, the fear of God, the fear of not being good enough, not praying enough, not being worthy enough. This fear paralyzes the soul and keeps it at a distance. Don Dolindo's vision wipes it away completely. Jesus does not demand perfection at Christmas. He does not ask for flawless souls. He asks to be taken into our arms. He asks us to stop staring endlessly at our sins and failures and to look into his eyes instead. Eyes that search for us, not to condemn, but to be loved. And here, in this gaze, we begin to understand the solution to his sorrow. How do we warm this child? How do we remove the cold that makes him tremble? Jesus revealed to Don Dolindo that what warms him is not extraordinary penances or heroic sacrifices. It is something far simpler and far more difficult: total abandonment, complete surrender. To abandon oneself does not mean to deny reality. It means to place reality into his hands. It is the interior act of saying, "Jesus, I cannot carry this anymore. You take care of it." Don Dolindo taught that when a soul does this sincerely, something miraculous happens. The heart becomes a cradle. Anxiety loosens its grip. The agitation that exhausts the soul begins to quiet. He invites us to imagine speaking to the baby Jesus in the manger, telling him honestly about our problems, the debts, the illnesses, the wounds that ache silently, and then, instead of clinging to them with fear, placing them into his tiny hands, becoming small with him, trusting that he, though small, is still God. Don Dolindo said that at that moment the soul that surrenders becomes warm. It is as if we wrap the child Jesus in a thick blanket of trust. He stops crying. He smiles. And when Jesus smiles within the soul, the mountains that seemed immovable begin to melt like snow in the sun. Not always instantly, not always in the way we expect, but truly and deeply.
Jesus told Don Dolindo, "Why do you panic? Let me do it."
These words carry immense power. Even in the manger, he remains the King of Kings. He enters the filth of the stable, which is our misery, and transforms it into a palace. But he does not force his way in. He waits for permission. Surrender is that permission. Every act of despair chills the stable of the heart. Every act of trust lights a fire. Don Dolindo used to say that a single act of trust is worth more than 1,000 fasts, because it touches the very heart of God. And this is why the sorrow of Jesus on Christmas is so profound. Not because of poverty, not because of suffering, but because so few are willing to trust him completely. This question that Jesus places before the soul does not accuse, it invites. It waits patiently for an answer that can only be given in freedom. Leaving him out in the cold does not always look like open rejection. More often it looks like a heart that is busy, crowded, noisy. A heart that prays but does not rest. A heart that believes, yet clings tightly to control. Don Dolindo understood that the deepest pain of Jesus is not caused by sin alone, but by distrust. Sin wounds, but distrust freezes. Sin can be confessed and healed, but distrust keeps the door half closed, just enough to keep Jesus from entering fully. Jesus revealed to Don Dolindo that every time a soul insists on managing everything alone, it unknowingly recreates the loneliness of Bethlehem. There was no room at the inn not because people were evil, but because they were occupied. Their homes were full, their schedules full, their minds full, and so the Son of God was born outside. This mystery repeats itself whenever we are too full of ourselves to make space for him, too full of plans, too full of fears, too full of explanations. Don Dolindo saw clearly that control is often disguised as responsibility. We tell ourselves we must worry because no one else will. We must calculate because the future is uncertain. We must defend ourselves because no one understands us. But Jesus gently exposes the lie hidden within this mindset. He shows that control is often fear wearing a mask, and fear, when it rules the heart, leaves no room for love.
The child Jesus comes to Don Dolindo trembling not only from the cold of human indifference,
But from the weight of our refusal to rest in him. He comes poor so that we might dare to approach him with our own poverty. He comes fragile so that we might entrust him with our fragility. He does not demand strength. He asks for weakness offered without resistance. Don Dolindo wrote that Jesus wants to be loved, not for what he gives, but for who he is. And this is why surrender is so precious to him. When we say, Jesus, take care of it, we are not escaping responsibility. We are placing responsibility where it truly belongs. We are acknowledging that he is God and we are not. That simple truth, live sincerely, restores order to the soul. Jesus explained to Don Dolindo that abandonment is an act of love more than an act of trust. It is the soul saying, I choose you over my fear. This choice warms him because it mirrors his own choice in the incarnation. Just as he abandoned himself into the hands of Mary and Joseph, trusting their care, he asks us to abandon ourselves into his hands with the same simplicity. This abandonment is not emotional passivity. It is an active interior decision repeated again and again. Every time anxiety rises, the soul has a choice: to tighten its grip or to open its hands, to replay fears endlessly or to whisper, Jesus, you see this. Don Dolindo insisted that this prayer must be short and sincere, because long explanations often hide resistance. The heart that truly trusts does not argue, it rests. Jesus showed him that the soul that abandons itself becomes light, not because problems disappear immediately, but because the burden is no longer carried alone. The soul begins to experience a strange freedom even in suffering, a freedom that does not depend on circumstances. This is the peace the world cannot give, because the world cannot understand it. It is born not from solutions, but from presence. Don Dolindo also perceived that surrender wounds pride deeply. It strips the soul of the illusion of self-sufficiency. This is why it is resisted so strongly. We prefer to suffer in control than to rest in dependence. Yet the child in the manger reveals the truth we avoid. Dependence is not humiliation, it is love. God himself chose it. Jesus told Don Dolindo that when a soul abandons itself, heaven moves silently. Graces are released that could not be given before, not because God withheld them, but because the soul was closed. Trust opens channels that effort cannot. And often these graces work invisibly, rearranging events, softening hearts, redirecting paths in ways we only understand later. The cold Jesus feels is intensified when souls pray anxiously, when prayer becomes a list of demands instead of an act of trust. Don Dolindo warned that prayer without a ban. Dormant becomes heavy, exhausting, and discouraging. But prayer, rooted in surrender, becomes light, even when it is brief. A single act of trust can accomplish more than hours of restless supplication. Jesus revealed that many souls decorate him with words but leave him starving for trust. They speak of faith yet refuse to let him act. They say they believe yet panic at the first sign of uncertainty. This contradiction pains him deeply because it keeps love at a distance. Love cannot grow where fear rules. Don Dolindo understood that Christmas is the feast of divine patience. God does not force himself upon humanity. He waits hidden, small, vulnerable. He waits to be welcomed, not into perfect hearts, but into honest ones. Hearts that admit their fear and choose trust anyway. Hearts that say, I do not understand, but I believe you are here. Jesus told him that every act of forgiveness warms him, because forgiveness is trust applied to pain. When we forgive, we are saying, Jesus, I place this injustice into your hands. Every time we refuse forgiveness, the heart stiffens and the cold deepens. Forgiveness opens space where grace can breathe. The child Jesus also showed Don Dolindo that despair wounds him more than sin, because despair denies his power. It says silently, "This is beyond you," and nothing is beyond him. Despair seals the heart, while trust cracks it open, even if only slightly. Through that small opening, grace enters. Don Dolindo often repeated that Jesus is most powerful when he seems weakest. The manger is the throne from which he conquers hearts, not by force, but by love, not by fear, but by invitation. The soul that understands this no longer needs to defend itself constantly. It learns to hide within him. Jesus revealed that surrender does not remove the cross, but it changes its weight. Carried alone, the cross crushes. Carried with him, it sanctifies. This is why he asks not for heroic acts, but for daily trust. The quiet trust of ordinary moments. The trust that does not seek to be seen. The sorrow of Jesus at Christmas is softened. Every time a soul dares to rest, every time a soul stops rehearsing future disasters and instead whispers his name, every time a soul chooses confidence over calculation. Don Dolindo believed that this hidden trust consoles Jesus more than grand celebrations or external devotion. He saw that the stable becomes warm, not through effort, but through presence. When Jesus is welcomed, even misery becomes sacred. Even confusion becomes bearable. Even suffering becomes meaningful. Not because it is explained, but because it is shared. Jesus waits for this welcome in silence. He does not shout. He does not accuse. He waits with open arms, small and patient. The question remains alive in every heart, especially at Christmas. Will there be room for him, not in words, but in trust? When Don Dolindo contemplated this waiting of Jesus, he understood that the silence of the child is itself Allah. Language. It is the silence of a God who refuses to dominate, a God who chooses to be vulnerable so that love may be free. In this silence, Jesus does not demand answers, he listens. He receives the trembling of the soul that does not know how to trust yet desires to learn. Even this desire, Don Dolindo realized, already warms him. Jesus revealed that many souls believe surrender means losing themselves. In reality, surrender is where the soul is finally found. When we cling to control, we shrink. When we abandon ourselves, we expand. The soul begins to breathe. Don Dolindo described this as a hidden resurrection that happens quietly, without noise, within ordinary days. It is not dramatic, but it is real. The child Jesus showed him that trust must be renewed constantly, because fear returns easily. Fear is persistent. It knocks repeatedly. That is why abandonment is not a single heroic act, but a rhythm of the heart, a gentle returning. Each time fear rises, the soul is invited again to place everything into his hands. And each time it does, even imperfectly, grace deepens its roots. Don Dolindo saw that Jesus rejoices when we are honest with him. Not when we pretend to be calm, but when we admit we are afraid and still choose to trust. This honesty delights him because it opens the door to intimacy, a relationship without masks. The child Jesus does not ask for beautiful words. He listens to the cry beneath them. Jesus also revealed that the soul that abandons itself becomes a refuge for others. When trust replaces anxiety, peace radiates quietly. Others feel it without knowing why. This is how the warmth of Christmas spreads, not through speeches, but through hearts that rest. Don Dolindo understood that the world is not changed by noise, but by hidden souls who trust deeply. The child in the manger showed him that he carries our time within himself. Past wounds, present fears, future uncertainties. When we surrender, we place all time into his eternity. This is why trust heals memories and softens the fear of what is to come. The soul no longer needs to run ahead of itself.
Jesus confided that impatience wounds trust. When we demand immediate results, we place conditions on love.
Don Dolindo learned that true abandonment waits without bitterness. It hopes without calculation. It allows God to act in his way and his time. This waiting is not empty, it is filled with presence. The child, Jesus, also showed him how easily we confuse surrender with resignation. Resignation is heavy and bitter. Surrender is light and peaceful. Resignation says, there is nothing to be done. Surrender says, you will do what is needed. One closes the heart, the other opens it. Don Dolindo perceived that when a soul truly abandons itself, it no longer needs constant reassurance. It becomes anchored. External storms may continue, but the interior remains still. This stillness is not indifference, it is confidence. A confidence born from knowing that one is held. Jesus revealed that this confidence glorifies the Father more than any visible success, because it proclaims silently that God is trustworthy, that His love is enough. This silent proclamation echoes far beyond the soul that lives it. The child Jesus also showed Don Dolindo that suffering accepted with trust becomes fruitful in ways we cannot see. It becomes intercession. It becomes shelter for others. It becomes a place where grace flows. Nothing is wasted when placed into His hands. Don Dolindo learned that Jesus is especially close to souls who feel they have failed, because failure humbles. It breaks illusions. It prepares the heart for trust. The child Jesus does not recoil from brokenness. He is drawn to it. Jesus waits patiently for the moment the soul stops defending itself and simply rests. This rest is not sleep, but awareness. Awareness of His presence. Awareness that we are not alone. In this awareness, even suffering becomes a meeting place. The warmth that consoles Jesus is contagious. One trusting heart warms another. One surrendered soul gives courage to another. This is how the cold of the world is slowly undone. Not all at once, but faithfully. Don Dolindo understood that Christmas is not a single night, but a posture of the soul. Whenever we choose trust over fear, the child is born again within us. Whenever we say, even through tears, I place this in your hands, the manger fills with light. Jesus continues to wait in this way, quietly, lovingly, without pressure. He waits for trust more than for words. He waits for surrender more than for effort. And in this waiting, love remains ready to transform everything that is given to it. As Don Dolindo entered the final years of his life, marked by illness and deep physical suffering, this mystery of trust did not fade. It intensified. Those who were close to him noticed that as his body weakened, his peace grew stronger. He was living proof that surrender is not a theory, but a way of existing. He had learned to let Jesus live His own life within him, and in doing so, he became a living manger, a place where Christ could rest even amid pain. Don Dolindo often said that the greatest temptation of the spiritual life is not sin, but agitation. Agitation scatters the soul, it divides the heart, it exhausts prayer. Jesus showed him that agitation always comes from trying to carry tomorrow without God. The soul rushes ahead, imagining outcomes, rehearsing losses, creating fears that have not yet arrived. And while the mind runs forward, Jesus remains behind, waiting to be trusted in the present moment. The child Jesus revealed that He comes to us always in the present, not in yesterday's regrets, not in tomorrow's fears, only now. This is why surrender must also be now, not later, not when things improve, not when we feel stronger. Trust offered in weakness is especially precious because it is pure. It has no illusions. Don Dolindo understood that many souls postpone trust. They say, I will trust when I understand, or I will trust when this problem is solved. But Jesus gently reveals that trust itself is what allows solutions to unfold, not always as we imagine, but always in a way that leads us closer to Him. Trust is not a reward at the end of the road, it is the road. Jesus showed him that the manger was chosen deliberately, not a palace, not a temple, but a place of animals, of dirt, of simplicity. This was not an accident, it was a prophecy. God chooses what is low, so that no one need fear approaching Him. Our own inner stable, messy and imperfect, is precisely where He wants to be born. This is why Don Dolindo insisted that we must never wait to be ready for Jesus. Readiness is not cleanliness. Readiness is openness. A heart that says, come as I am, is already prepared. The child Jesus does not recoil from chaos, he enters it to transform it from within. As Christmas returns each year, Jesus still asks the same silent question he asked through Don Dolindo: will there be room for me? Not room in decorations or traditions, but room in trust. Will you allow me to carry what you have been carrying alone? Will you let me be God for you? Leaving him out in the cold is rarely a deliberate choice. It happens quietly, through habits of worry, bitterness, resentment, and fear. But welcoming him is also quiet. It happens when we pause, even briefly, and say with sincerity, Jesus, I place this in your hands. Heaven listens to that sentence. Don Dolindo taught that this simple prayer is not weakness. It is courage. It takes courage to stop fighting imaginary battles. It takes courage to forgive when the wound is still tender. It takes courage to hope when circumstances do not change immediately, and this courage delights the heart of Jesus more than any external success. The child Jesus does not ask for explanations. He asks for presence. He does not ask for heroic strength. He asks for a heart that will rest against his. In that closeness, fear slowly loosens its grip. The soul learns to breathe again. And so the message entrusted to Don Dolindo comes gently to its close, not with fear, but with invitation. Christmas is not about what we achieve for God. It is about what we allow God to do for us. The greatest gift we can offer the child Jesus is not perfection, but trust. Not brilliance, but surrender. Not control, but love. If we give him this gift, the cold that pains him will be warmed. The stable of the heart will fill with light, and we will discover that the God who became a child is still strong enough to carry everything we place into his hands. This is the secret sorrow of Christmas, and also its greatest joy. A God who waits to be trusted, a child who waits to be held. May we not pass him by again. May we make room for him now, with open hands and a quiet heart.